Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to class. Today we are going to talk about 20th century theoretical developments in linguistics. So we are going to cover almost all major schools of different schools of thoughts and methods and techniques that they adopted and how modern linguistics got the shape that we see it today. So it's a journey of 100 years, approximately 100 years that we are going to cover in this discussion. So 20th century theoretical developments in linguistics. As we discussed earlier also while talking about Saussure and his work, we saw that Saussure was on the threshold of a paradigm shift in linguistics and language studies. He was trained in philology and historical linguistics. That was the trend of that time. And from the late 18th century, that can be extended up to 19th century, the period witnessed studies in historical linguistics and reconstruction of Proto-Indo-European languages by tracing the divergence to contemporary languages of India, Iran and Europe. Saussure was part of that tradition. And early 20th century saw an emergence of descriptive linguistics, which was primarily concerned with the description of a single language at a given point of time. But Saussure's own work in the beginning of 20th century witnessed a very witnessed a change. Saussure made a huge change through his works, and that period witnessed an influential work course in general linguistics, though this was published posthumously in 1916. Saussure died in 1913. It was published in 1916. This book was compiled by his students posthumously, Charles Belly and Albert Chachet, out of their lecture notes they had taken from Saussure's lecture in Geneva. And that book proved to be a milestone and a turning point in the approach, methods, and theoretical constructs in language study. And that laid the foundation of structuralism as a theoretical approach. If you look at Saussure's key concepts that is well documented in this book, Saussure looked at language as a systemic language as an object of systemic contrast and equivalent objects. Language consists of a string of linguistic objects like words, phonemes, morphemes, all in contrast and opposition. Saussure made a radical change in understanding language as a phenomenon, and he introduced binary ideas like langue and parole. We have already talked about langue and parole in detail. He introduced ideas like syntagmatic and paradigmatic relations. He talked about synchrony and diachrony, synchronic linguistics and diachronic linguistics, internal and external linguistics, right? So he talked about sign, signifier and signified, right? So a linguistic signifier is a combination of a composite form of the sound image, the actual sounds, and the concept it relates to. And he also established that there is no logical connection between the signifier and the signified. And these ideas and this approach of looking at language laid foundations of structuralism. Though Saussure never used this term structuralism, in fact, it was introduced by Roman Jakobson. So, Saussure believed that language has a formal structure and should be studied in a structural perspective. And a structuralist believed that language should be first studied from a synchronic point of view, not a diachronic point of view, since the diachronic point of view is dependent on synchronic point of view. So they preferred studying language from synchronic point of view. That means language at a given point of time. So these are the basic tenets of structuralism, and this movement was spread all over, out of which two schools are very important and prominent. One is European structuralism and the other is American structuralism. In Europe also, we have the Prague Circle, the Copenhagen Circle, and the Vienna Science Circle. So it was spread all over Europe, and the Prague School is one which is very influential in European structuralism. And parallel to that, we see American structuralism, which is primarily led by Leonard Bloomfield. And we'll talk about American structuralists like, Sir Edward Sapir. American structuralism was highly influenced with anthropological works and frameworks in psychology, behaviorism. European structuralism was highly influenced and deeply, rooted in Saussurean work with Saussurean idea. However, American structuralism has a little departure in technique and methods used for analyzing language data. So the idea and approach of Saussure made significant paradigm shift not only in linguistics but in a whole range of areas such as literature, philosophy, sociology, and other related disciplines. Saussure saw language as a formal system with various constituting elements, and it should be analyzed despite complexities in real time of speech production. And drawing primarily from the works by Saussure, 1920s witnessed an emergence of structuralism in the language studies and linguistics. The decade 1920s witnessed a shift in approaches with meticulous and sophisticated methods in analyzing language use as a system with subdisciplines such as phonology, morphology, syntax, semantics, etc. And we see a departure from historical linguistic and philological approaches. So 1920s onwards, we did not look at sound change in its diachronic perspective. In fact, we had a vantage point of looking at language from synchronic point of view, and that is a departure in structuralism. Saussure himself never used the term structuralism in his work, in his lectures, in his discussions, and it was Roman Jakobson who coined the term in 1929 in reference to an emerging new method which was being used at the time in linguistics as well as other disciplines such as literary theory and studies, psychology, sociology, and anthropology. So this term was coined in 1929 by Roman Jakobson. But the traits and the features and the methods and the techniques used in structuralism was highly influenced by the works of Ferdinand de Saussure. If we look at European structuralism movement, we have three important schools of thoughts and practices: the Prague Circle, the Copenhagen Circle, and the Vienna Science Circle. Out of the three, Prague Circle, which was founded in 2026, in fact, was highly influenced and made a deeper impact in language studies, and it is also credited for leading this movement of structuralism in Europe. So, European structuralists had emphasis on the view that meaning is an inherent aspect of language system, and you have to notice this aspect, that European structuralism looked at meaning deeply embedded in the structure, inherent in the structure. So, they did not look at meaning as a secondary aspect as we see in American structuralism. So, there is a difference. And they believe that it is not reducible to external factors or references. The Prague Linguistic Circle was founded formally in 1926 by a group of scholars like Roman Jakobson, B. Havernack, V. Matthias, J. Mukarovsky, N.S. Trubetskoy, and B. Tranka. So, they were the founders of Prague Circle, and we all understand Roman Jakobson's contribution, and we know the phonology, right? Genetic phonology and other things that though Pragians became particularly known for their seminal research in phonology, and their work encompasses much more. The members of the Prague Circle describe themselves as both a structuralist and functionalist. They describe themselves as a structuralist because they believed that every element of a language is part of paradigmatic structure. The sound structure of language, for example, its lexical structure, its intonational structure, etc. And they also call themselves functionalists because they believed that each linguistic unit as existing only in as far as it serves a particular purpose with which ultimately contributes to the communicative function of language. So, they looked at language from a structural point of view, and they looked at language from functional point of view, and that is why they call themselves as structuralists as well as functionalists, right? And they produce a lot of seminal work in formal linguistics, theoretical linguistics. Specifically, their impact on phonology is worth mentioning here. If you look at American structuralism, which roughly started in 30s and continued up to 50s before the advent of Chomsky linguistics in the scene, and the practitioners of American structuralism are Edward Sapir, who was basically an anthropologist and a linguist, Leonard Bloomfield, who is known as the champion of American structuralism, Zelling Harris and Charles Hawkins, and many of their followers and students. They practiced American structuralism. And as I mentioned, unlike European structuralism, American structuralism paid more attention to a structure of the language as compared to the semantic aspect of it, meaning aspect of it. However, European structuralism looked at meaning as an inherent component of linguistic structure. So, that was the departure. American structuralism was influenced and led by Leonard Bloomfield. The Bloomfieldian structuralism declined after 1950s as the generative paradigm or the Chomsky way of doing linguistics and language studies arrived in mid-1950s and got consolidated in 1960s. So we see a paradigm shift after mid-1950s in American structuralism. When we look at the characteristics of American structuralism, the focus area was writing descriptive grammar of unwritten indigenous American languages, led by Bloomfield, though Sapir also studied such indigenous languages. American structuralism and the approach it followed involved collecting data from the native speakers, analyzing the corpus of collected data solely on the basis of identified linguistic items and their distribution within the corpus. And Bloomfield developed a method of collecting data that is known as observant method. In that method, he would call the native speaker in the class or the place where he and his students were collecting data, and they would get data directly from the native speaker, and they would analyze, they will do the analysis, phonetic analysis, syntactic analysis, and study the linguistic items and their distribution in this collected corpus of data. They paid little or negligible attention to the semantic aspects and focused more on the structural properties of the language. American structuralism talks about levels of representation, building blocks of language, right? Like phonology, morphology, syntax. Semantics and pragmatics were included but not paid much attention to. So they were more interested in the structural aspect of representation at the level of phonology, at the level of morphology, at the level of syntax, sentence structures. American structuralism focused on externally perceptible and observable data, paying a special attention to speech. And we can trace this influence from the behaviorist paradigm, because American structuralism was heavily influenced by behaviorist paradigm. In a while, we'll talk about behaviorism that relied on analyzing language and understanding language acquisition process in terms of externally perceptible data, that is speech. So not the underlying factors, motivating that speech. So they were all interested in the externally perceptible data. So whatever they got from the informant, respondent, their analysis was based on that. American structuralism also focused on linguistic analysis of forms of linguistic object, structure of linguistic object, and relegating secondary place or secondary status to meaning. Bloomfield believed that phonology is the starting point of any language analysis, any linguistic investigation, and said that linguistic study must always start from the phonetic form and not from the meaning. So here we find a very clear distinction between European structuralism and American structuralism, where European structuralism looked at language, looked at meaning deeply embedded in the structure. However, the American structuralists looked at the structure independently, and the meaning was relegated to secondary status in their analysis. And this trend continued up to almost mid-1950s. American linguistics as practiced from 1930s to the 1950s as a structural, although its theoretical and methodological principles were considerably different from European structuralism, and Saussure's influence on American structuralism was very limited. whereas European post-war schools and people who practiced structuralism and the structuralist movement, they all fall within the purview of structuralism as uh, you know uh, you know promoted and started with the works inspired from the works of Saussure. It was more grounded in Saussurean work and Saussurean concepts. Though they had differences in various important methodological issues, but broadly, what they have in common is that they all were deeply influenced by the works, concepts, and approaches of Saussure. But as opposed to European structuralism, American structuralism was more into structure, restricted influence of Saussure's work and concepts, and meaning was relegated to secondary status in their analysis, as Bloomfield himself believed that any linguistic investigation must start with the form, not from the meaning. So this is structuralism, and what we see from beginning of 20th century to middle of 20th century, almost half of 20th century, was heavily influenced by methods, techniques, and approaches in structuralism. And we have a parallel, uh, paradigm being practiced in behaviorism, in psychology, known as behaviorism. And behaviorism in psychology heavily influenced works in American structuralism for the fact that psychology and the behaviorist paradigm in psychology looked at externally perceptible speech and analyzed. So they looked at language as behavior, right, at the actual act, and that also influenced approaches in structuralist American structuralist tradition. And we can see that influence when we look at audiolingual method of teaching. Bloomfield himself and his students wrote a lot of descriptive grammar based on American structural approach. And not to mention the 1933 book called Language by Leonard Bloomfield is considered as the key document or the significant milestone publication to understand American structuralism. Now, coming to behaviorism, that started in the late 20s and continued up to late 50s, uh, culminates into B.F. Skinner's work, Verbal Behavior, in 1957. So, three names are very important when we look at that particular period: B.F. Skinner, John B. Watson, and Ivan Pavlov. Though other psychologists also worked during the period, but these three names are important in terms of emergence of behaviorist paradigm in language, right? That emanated from psychology. So B.F. Skinner talked about covert behavior, including cognition and emotions, which is subject to the same controlling variables as observable behavior, and he gave the theory of operant conditioning in 1937. John B. Watson talked about methodological behaviorism in 1924, and he also promoted external perceptible behavior. Pavlov investigated how conditioned neutral stimuli elicit reflexes in respondents controlling, so stimulus and response, drawing from classical conditioning. Skinner published his monumental work in 1957 called Verbal Behavior, that can also be seen as a summarized document of the concepts, beliefs, and approaches of behaviorism. and it looked at language as verbal behavior. And the fundamental tenets of this entire approach was uh, stimulus response chain, the idea that child is born with a tabula rasa, and stimulus response chain, operant conditioning, role of reinforcement, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and habit formation. So it relied on externally perceptible behavior, linguistic behavior, to describe and understand language. This work and this approach of behaviorists was severely criticized by Noam Chomsky, and he systematically, quashed the arguments put forward by behaviorists led by Skinner. However, Skinner later made a remark saying that Chomsky did not get the essence of the explanation. However, Chomsky's arrival was marked in late 50s with his standard theory, and Chomsky's enterprise is known as generative grammar in linguistics. So now we enter into a new paradigm called generative grammar. Chomsky made a very important, significant change in the explanation of language as a phenomenon. And if you look at Chomsky's approach, we can see the summarized statement that Chomsky gives in his Aspects of Theory of Syntax 1965 publication. He says, linguistic theory is concerned primarily with an ideal speaker listener in a completely homogeneous speech community who knows its speech language perfectly and is unaffected by such grammatically irrelevant conditions as memory limitations, distractions, shifts of attention and interest, and errors, random or characteristics, in applying his knowledge of language in actual performance. Chomsky started with three etymological questions. What is knowledge of language? How this knowledge of language is acquired? And how this knowledge of language is put into practice. Chomsky talks about underlined tacit linguistic structures in human mind. And he says that human child is born with an innate capacity to learn, to acquire a language. So he postulated two hypotheses, linguistic nativism and innateness hypothesis, right? And he talks about the infinite creativity of language and linguistic structures, because with finite set of rules, we are able to generate infinite number of utterances. He postulates concepts like LAD, language acquisition device, universal grammar. So he is not talking about uh, language specific grammar. He talks about universal principles that govern human language are underlyingly tacitly there in human mind when we are born. And basically, acquisition of language is nothing but hypothesis testing. This is what he talks about. And the whole idea of principles and parameters he puts forward. So, principles that govern human languages and parameters that distinguish them. So, languages have, English is different from Mexican because of parametric variations, but principally they all share the same underlying principle. A child is born with that knowledge of underlying principle, and the input or the stimulus is available in the immediate environment called primary linguistic data triggers that mechanism, the conceptual apparatus known as LD, and a child is able to frame grammatical rules, and through hypothesis testing, the he also puts forward the argument that the rate at which children learn vocabulary is self-explanatory for the fact that they don't require stimulus for everything that they learn. So he talks about poverty of stimulus, right? That means the input available for the child in the environment is erroneous, idiosyncratic, incomplete, and fuzzy. But that doesn't deter a child to pick up any language in the environment. So he uh, assigns a lot of autonomy and agency to the child or human child or mind, that acquires language. So this is the journey, structuralism, then post-structuralism, then behaviorist paradigm, then generative linguistics, and within this paradigm, we see a lot of other developments. In fact, generative grammar itself had multiple milestones and it has witnessed a lot of revisions and changes. And if you trace the history and development of generative grammar since 1950s onwards, what we see, standard theory that came in, so that is the period for 1956 to 1965, aspect of syntax, Chomsky's next publication. Then extended standard theory, 1965 to 1973, where he talks about syntactic constraints. So, generative grammar talks about syntactic constraints, and we have X bar theory, a generalized phrase structure. Then revised extended standard theory, 1973 to 1976, where we have restrictions upon X bar theory, assumptions of the complementizer position, and a very important tool to analyze data, linguistic data, is move alpha, right? And then we have government and banding theory, principles and parameters theory, 1981 to 1990, and then Chomsky produces in 1993 minimalist program. So that period is 1990s onwards till date. We have minimalist program, is a line of inquiry that hypothesizes that human language faculty is optimal, containing only what is necessary to meet human physical and communicative needs, and seeks to identify the necessary properties of such a system. It was proposed by Chomsky in 1993. So this is the development in linguistics, starting from Saussure and 1916 publication of his course in general linguistics, to structuralism and Saussure work, then Edward Sapire's work, then Leonard Bloomfield and his major work published in Language, 1937 onwards, and then approach and methods, his observant method, emphasis on understanding the structure of the language and talking about building blocks of language, levels of representation. Then we have parallel to that American structuralism, we have European structuralism, and then we get into behaviorist paradigm. Behaviorist paradigm had deep influence on structuralism, specifically American structuralism. And then in 1957 onwards, we find arrival of Chomsky and Chomsky linguistics, known as generative grammar. And in response to Chomsky generative grammar, we have many other linguists coming with parallel proposals, contradictory proposals. Among them, very important work by M.A.K. Halliday, Systemic Functions of Language, Systemic Grammar, that he worked on. Then, relational grammar for that matter, context-free grammar for that matter. So, lots of developments from 1950s to 1990s. And then, during that period, a parallel approach was evolving, which Chomsky looked at linguistics from computational point of view, right? Underlined the structures and how human mind computes these structures. So, it is also called mentalism. And Chomsky paid a lot of attention on competence. He talks about linguistic competence. So, paid lots of attention about the underlined structures and their functions. In opposed to that, we have people like Delheims, who talked about communicative competence, paying a lot of attention to language in use. So, Chomsky talks about more about computational aspect of linguistics, of language and human mind, and paying less attention to performance. So, he is more concerned about linguistic competence, and he says that the goal of linguistic theory should be to predict the universal principles and the computation of data in human mind. But opposed to that, we have people like Delheims, people like M.K. Halliday, who are talking about language in actual use, language in socio-cultural context. And Delheims comes up with communicative competence in 1970, 72 for that matter. Halliday talks about systemic functions of language and the language acquisition by human child. He talks about 7 systemic functions. If you want to know more about systemic functions, you can see M.K. Halliday's systemic function. The video we have already done. You can also watch the video that we did on exclusively on Chomsky and linguistic competence. You can understand and see the video on Delheim's communicative competence that we did in detail. And if you want to understand Chomsky and linguistics, you can see the innateness hypothesis that we did in a particular video. You can also understand behaviorism and behaviorist approach in language acquisition that we did in separate video. But during that time, another movement was taking place, and a subdiscipline of linguistics, later on it is called sociolinguistics, emerged during 1960s with various techniques and methods applied by different scholars away from these developments, a parallel development of this sort. And the few founding pillars of this discipline are William Lebov, for that matter, who pioneered a school devoted to showing the relevance of social determinants of variation for linguistic theory, and he established that linguistic structures are parallel to social structures and they are related. Then we have a person like Basil Bernstein, a British sociologist who worked on class-related codes, so class and codes. His work was severely criticized on account of different reasons, but he was the one who talked about class and code. So, language, restricted code, elaborate code. Delheims, another important founding father of sociolinguistics, who shaped the ethnography of communication, and educational linguistics, who molded sociolinguistics by editing several pioneer volumes and the flagship journal Language in Society. Then we have John Gumperz, known better for his interactional sociolinguistics. So, they are all talking about language in action, language in use, language in a socio-cultural space. So, they are not talking like Chomsky and generative grammar, abstractness in terms of abstractness of linguistic structures, but actually they are talking about the concrete realization of it in a particular socio-cultural space. Charles Ferguson's work in diglossia, very important milestone publication. Joshua Fishman's approach in sociology of language. Similarly, William Wright, who studied native languages and cultures of California, research on Native American languages. Ellen Grimshaw, who looked at language in a social context. Einar Huygens, who looked at bilingualism and language shift. He was the first linguist to write about ecology of language and also talked about language planning and policy. Uriel Van Rijk and his work on understanding language contact, causes and effects, minority languages, and language vitality, language revival. Similarly, Suzanne, so Suzanne Irvin Tripp talked about distinction between compound and coordinate bilingualism, child language acquisition, etc. So this was a parallel development, parallel to other theoretical developments in the field, and this is the journey of linguistics, modern linguistics in 20th century. We'll talk about emergence of social linguistics more in our next video, and I hope that you are now able to trace the history of theoretical developments in linguistics right from Ferdinand de Saussure, his work, birth of structuralism, practice of structuralism, spread of structuralism till 1950. The structuralism dominated half of a century, and then we see arrival of Chomsky, generative grammar, and also see the severe criticism of behaviorist paradigm of language, arrival of generative grammar. Generative grammar has gone multiple changes, revisions, and now today we have minimalist program. And parallel to this, a number of other programs, other approaches, other theories also developed, and a sub-discipline came out of all these is modern sociolinguistics, and these are the founding fathers of modern sociolinguistics. So thank you very much for now. We will meet in our next class.